You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech Podcast. I have Mike Bartlett. He's part of the National Governors Association. He's a senior policy analyst for the Economic Opportunity Division of the National Governors Association Center for Best Practices. He's also an advisor to senior state officials for post-secondary education, focusing on talent development strategies and aligning education and workforce development. So, Mike, thanks for coming. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Glad to be with you. And, for the listeners, thanks for tuning in. And also, sorry for the very long title. That's just how we kind of do things in D.C.
Oh, no problem. So we're going to be talking about the effects of automation, I would guess, on, myriad industries. And I don't know if we're going to focus on governance or not, but what do you look at in your position? What's your focus as it relates to automation, and what are the thoughts in your office?
Of course. So, again, I sit within what we call NGA Solutions. So the National Governors Association represents the 55 governors of the states and territories. And we're here to help governors in and across every single policy area that they may encounter. In my day-to-day, I specifically focus on post-secondary education and workforce development. So how do we connect people to careers and to economic opportunity? And, if you look at Governor's State of the States addresses, if you look at kind of the things that are keeping governors up at night, preparing for the future of work is kind of at the top of the list right now. There's no shortage of new research and new articles and new work being done all the time on the impacts automation will have on states' economies and on states' labor forces. So we're actually spending a lot of our time right now helping to help governors and their staff understand what is coming down the pike with regards to new technologies, how will that impact what they're doing in their states, and how they can make sure that the citizens of their state are prepared for the future.
So, that's a big goal. You'd probably have to reach out to schools, universities, you'd have to reach out to large employers, to get their feedback on what they're looking for and how they're changing. You'd have to, speak to various groups of citizens from different demographics and industries. There's a lot of work there. How do you even begin to coordinate an effort like that?
That's a great question. And I think it's important to note, we're not alone in this. There are no shortage of organizations who are out there kind of on the ground level doing this work, doing this research and analysis. So a lot of our role at the National Governors Association is being avid consumers of research, going out, visiting people in states, talking to governor staff, talking to employers, just talking to everyone we can about this issue to understand what's going on, and then try and translate that into actionable things that governors can use. For example, there have been quite a few studies out by groups like Oxford and Accenture and McKinsey Global Institute looking at different trends in automation and different impacts it may have on the labor force. A governor and their senior staff don't really have the time to sit down and read a few hundred pages of a report. So part of our job is to take all of those, analyze them, talk to the authors, figure out kind of what the common consensus is, and then package that in something that's useful for our constituents. And a lot of it's just kind of listening. I travel a lot to the states and sit down with business leaders, their chamber officials, and others, just trying to learn, what are the challenges they're facing, and then, share that nationally.
So what's a sampling of some of the things you've been hearing lately, and are any of them surprising to you, or is it, hey, yes, all right, that's obvious, but what do we do about it type thing?
Yeah, it's actually, we've been really focused on this work lately. One of the nice things about NGA is each year we have a chair from among the governors that rotates between the two political parties. Our chair this year is Governor Steve Bullock of Montana, and he chose as his initiative to focus all of the governors on something called Good Jobs for All Americans. And one of the big focuses of that initiative is understanding the future of work, including trends of automation and technologies, and what that means for workers in all sorts of different ways. I'd say the three biggest trends that we've heard, and we've held a series of regional workshops over the last year or so. Three of the biggest trends I'd summarize this way. One is we've talked a lot about technology. I think this includes automation, this includes AI, driverless cars, you name it. What's that going to mean for jobs and for people's livelihoods? I think one of the things that maybe wasn't surprising to me, but was maybe reassuring to hear is, when you really sort through all the research, there's a pretty strong case to be made that we're pretty unlikely to face mass joblessness. The robots aren't going to come and take all of our jobs, right? One of the challenges, or one of the nuances there, though, is that almost a large proportion of jobs will be impacted by technology. So just as when computerization happened, it didn't destroy a ton of jobs, but everybody had to learn how to integrate computers into the work they do every day. It's going to be the same when you look at AI technologies and so on and so forth. So it's really, we have a lot of people in the workforce today who don't have the skills to leverage that technology to make themselves more productive. So there's a huge need for looking at particularly the adult workforce and how do we get them tech savvy when it comes to these new tools that are coming. And that's an area we've often struggled as a country.
I was going to say, are there different segments of the population? I know every area has its segments, but do you think there's particular segments that are vulnerable to being left behind technologically?
There are. And this goes to another thing we've kind of seen loud and clear, that there are pretty big geographic disparities. Particularly many rural communities have fallen behind, but also a lot of it breaks out by kind of levels of educational attainment. For about one third of the workforce, they never actually recovered from the last Great Recession, and that was people who only had a high school diploma or less. They lost millions of jobs in the Great Recession, and they never really got them back. All the jobs we've gained since the recession have almost entirely gone to people with education and training beyond high school, be that a college degree or an apprenticeship or what have you. So if you're someone who was already kind of down and out because of the last wave of disruptions, if you don't have skills and you've maybe dropped out of the labor force, you're going to continue to be pummeled by these new changes. And that's, as we move towards an economy that requires a higher level of skills and training, people who don't have those skills are the ones greatest at risk.
Are you seeing any trade-offs? The groups that are adopting the most technology, is there anything about them that actually maybe perversely is causing them a problem, or is it a pretty strong correlation? The more adoption of technology, the better the people in a particular group are off.
That's a really interesting question. So by some measures, technological progress is how we increase worker productivity, which is kind of one of the main ways we increase standards of living. And if you look at the American economy as a whole, and there is regional variation, but there's this narrative that, robots are already taking jobs and that there's tons of automation happening. When you look at the big picture numbers, you could actually make a case that we're not seeing a lot of automation happening in companies. So you could almost make an argument that if we wanted to better support families and better, support the economy overall, we could actually do more to support automation, as long as we're able to make sure people are able to transition into the new job opportunities created by new types of automation.
Okay. So in looking at all the data you've seen and maybe some case studies and everything, what insights have you gotten? What's a better way to move forward than the way that's just currently happening naturally?
I'd say the biggest one is our approach in the United States to preparing people for their life and preparing them for their career is very, very front-loaded. We kind of put out a pathway where people, they go to high school, they graduate, then they go on to college and graduate, and then they're supposed to be set for life and they go into the workforce, and maybe an employer invests in training or something along those lines, but it's really a front-loaded model. I think we're seeing that start to strain, and we're seeing a lot of the issues we have today because learning is something that happens over someone's entire life, and particularly as technology changes faster and as the world of work moves at a faster pace than it has in the past, people are going to need to reinvent themselves at a much more rapid pace than they have in the past. So, one of the strategies we talk about a lot with states is kind of moving towards a system of lifelong learning. There's a lot of things you have to do to build that system. There's a lot of nuance we could get into there, but this idea that how do we constantly support people, you're in a job, you've been in a career, but maybe you want to switch to something else. How do we support you to do that? How do we get you back to school if that's what you need, or how do we get an employer to invest in an apprenticeship if that's a different pathway? We just need a more fluid way to talk about jobs and careers that's a lot less kind of linear or single path as they have been in the past.
Do you see a lot of anxiety from parents or from workers or from just people in general about the future and about their jobs and their careers and their prospects?
Oh, a tremendous amount. And, this is played out in the media. We actually, a couple of years ago, we had Elon Musk come give kind of a talk to all the governors. And he kind of scared everyone. He's very much one of those robots are coming for all your jobs guys. And when you talk with state policymakers, they have anxiety. And when you talk with kind of students, they don't know what they need. They don't know what the jobs are going to be. Governor, I've heard, the Lieutenant Governor of Maryland kind of say, we don't know what the jobs our kids are going to have. The jobs they're going to have haven't been created yet. So there is a lot of anxiety and uncertainty. And I think we've seen that kind of borne out in the political process and just the general atmosphere in the country right now.
Are there any pilot programs or examples where it appears as if people have been prepared well for the future and that's manifested itself in, great jobs that they've been able to acquire, or at least feedback from them that they feel now confident they're going to be able to handle anything?
Yeah, I have a couple. I think the biggest single strategy we've seen states trying to get to scale are, things like apprenticeship or other work-based learning opportunities. This idea of, the best way to learn how to work and how to, navigate the world of work is to actually work. So how do we better connect working and learning? So we're seeing a lot of new internships, apprenticeship programs. One in particular I always like to highlight was set up by Governor Herbert in Utah, and they called it the Utah Aerospace Pathways Program. And what it is, it's for high school juniors and seniors. They go to school 2 or 3 days a week, and then they go work for a company like Boeing 2 or 3 days a week. They do that for a couple of years. Then they're graduating with a high school diploma. They actually graduate with an associate's degree, so they have a lot of college credit, and they have a job ready for them. And, what the companies there have committed to is, hey, you go through this program, then you come work for us a couple of years, then we'll invest and we'll pay for you to get a bachelor's degree because we want to invest in you and your pathway here at this company. And we've seen that model be so successful that Utah has started to expand it to other industries because, employers are clamoring to find talented workers, and there's still a lot of workers who need to be connected to great careers. So states can play a really important role in kind of being a matchmaker, figuring out where the job opportunities are, where the people are, and bringing the two together, because it doesn't always happen by itself.
Yeah, I remember in college I did 2 co-op opportunities. I worked at Motorola and British Petroleum, and I feel like I'll remember those forever. And it gave me a great taste of what was ahead, in the workforce. And I remember also being young and volunteering at a veterinarian's office, and I've had a lot of experiences I feel really happy about, and it made me feel better about life and work and everything. So I'm sure other people having those experiences would help them too.
Exactly. I mean, you talk to almost anybody who's kind of successful in their career and ask them how they got there, and they'll say, well, I had an internship or a co-op or a really good mentor who helped me get on this right pathway. So it's really important for learning those, I don't like calling them soft skills because they're not soft, but those kind of human and relational skills, those critical skills that you need to navigate the world, because those are the types of skills you can't automate, right? And it also helps you understand what you're passionate about and what you don't want to do. I had a lot of internships that were helpful in helping me understand that, I really don't want to go down that pathway. That's not going to be the right one for me.
Any examples of learnings from other countries and how they're doing things that you think may be a good idea to try to incorporate here?
One of the one we talk about the most, or that gets the most attention, is actually Germany and Switzerland, and the kind of dual system for training and education they have. In Germany, I'm gonna forget the exact statistic, but it's something like a third of their CEOs started as apprentices, and they didn't go through kind of the traditional college track that they have in Germany. Now, a system like that won't perfectly translate here, but there are a lot of things we can learn about how the public sector and the private sector work together with education to make things happen. We actually took a delegation of governors and business leaders and kind of governors, other state officials on a study trip to Switzerland and Germany, where they were able to see it firsthand. And then you've seen them do tremendous things with that. Kentucky is one of those. Governor Bevin, recognizing the talent needs inside a state government, was able to set up a bunch of really interesting and innovative apprenticeship programs inside of state government. So everything from supporting the IT needs in state to healthcare providers in state government to a few other positions, because they were able to see how that model worked in another country, but apply it to a unique, specific state context, which is what you have to do here in America.
Yeah, how do governors communicate what's going on and what the results are? Like, for instance, maybe I'm not the most aware person, but I lived in Texas, I live in New York, and I've never heard the governor come out and say, "Hey, this is what we've done about jobs, and here's the results." And I know that the job is probably a thankless job, no matter what they do. People will find fault in everything, but how do you communicate? What metrics can you tell people, or what stories can you tell people to show them that these efforts are actually having an effect, so they can have less anxiety about the future?
That's a great, and that's a tough one. Communication and communication strategies are one of the things we talk about a lot, because if you could name almost any problem we face as a country, some community or some state has probably solved it somehow. But what we lack is a way to really get a clear and quick understanding of, well, what's going on everywhere. There's just so much activity happening. That's one of the things that governors really focus on, is how do we, one, understand even what's already happening and what we can build on in our state, and then how do we take things to scale and then communicate about that to different stakeholders. I'll highlight Iowa. Governor Reynolds in Iowa, and even Governor Branstad before her, started an initiative called Future Ready Iowa, where the governor brought together, the cabinet officials, but also the biggest business leaders around the state, and kind of built this whole task force focused on understanding these issues and creating a forum where businesses and the public sector could work together to solve problems. And, you know, the, and there are a number of other states that have had similar kind of high level initiatives. And a lot of them have found success being able to show, hey, we've set up this many new programs, we're filling this many more slots, we've increased degree attainment by X amount. But it's hard, and you know, the average person in a state's going to have trouble kind of connecting to that or understanding that. So it's an ongoing effort for sure.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking about the structure of government. I don't know if I have it right, but it seems like a governor's first go-to would be all the mayors of all the cities. You know, and it seems like they would have to keep close counsel with them, and that would be their network to reach out to the whole state and all the constituents. You know, kind of expand their efforts and their influence by talking to the mayors consistently, and then from there the next level down and down and down.
You know, one of the things that's been most interesting for me to learn in my time at NGA is how different every state is and how change filters down. So, you know, if we're talking about something like high schools, or if we're talking about colleges, the way a governor even interacts or influences them is going to be pretty different from state to state. So in some states, there might be an actual governing board for the colleges in the state. So, you know, there is a state agency that the governor makes appointments to or is under a governor, and they can kind of set the marching orders for institutions and hold them accountable in that way. In some other states, it's really, there might not even be a centralized body that the governor has any input in, that has any oversight over colleges and universities. So the levers that governors have vary so much, but you're absolutely right that there is a very common theme that whatever system you do have, you have to get buy-in, and you have to talk to local decision makers, whether that's your state legislature, whether that's mayors, whether that's county commissioners, whether that's superintendents of schools or local chambers. There's really just a huge number of actors you have to mobilize to make change on these really tough issues. One of the questions I always like to ask when I'm in a state and talking to state officials is, who's not at the table? Who aren't we talking to that we could be? For example, case in point, we were having conversations about rural communities. So how do we better make sure rural communities have resources? How do we make sure they're able to access economic opportunity given the many challenges they face? And someone brought up libraries. You know, many communities, even if they're rural, they probably have a library, and that serves as a hub for providing community services, for education, for healthcare sometimes. So, you know, if you're a governor, are you talking to your state library association to help you address the different challenges you're facing as a governor?
Yeah, I've driven through cross country a couple times, and one thing I noticed, I mean, I know that's all obvious, but most states are, there's a few big cities, and then the rest of the state's pretty rural. And I've lived in suburbs, I've lived in heavy city, I've never lived in a rural place, but I guess there's three experiences, at least, that people have. There's people that live in the heart of the city, and then there's people that live in the suburbs, and then there's people that live in more rural communities. So at least representatives from those three different groups need to be at the table, because they all have completely different experiences of daily life, resources and education and everything.
Oh, exactly. And even beyond that, not all rural areas are made the same either. I was born in Appalachia in southeastern Kentucky, and kind of the challenges that rural area faces compared to, say, North Dakota rural, where they may have, a booming oil industry, or, rural Montana, where they may have a big tourist industry. Kind of the challenge or the different issues they're facing can vary pretty significantly. The challenges, the trends that are causing these challenges are pretty similar across the entire country, but how you address them is going to look different, almost in every zip code.
Right, yeah, makes it even more complicated. So where do you observe that the U.S. is doing well to accommodate change? And where do you observe that we need to catch up or do a lot more work?
By a lot of, big picture economic measures, the U.S. is still very competitive. We lead the world in many types of innovation and adoption of technology. People want to live here, obviously, and we still have a generally pretty healthy economy compared to most of the rest of the world. I think something we could always do a better job of that other countries do more is invest in training and education for adults. If you look at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, they're a group that represents the major developed economies of the world. They've done comparisons of how much each country spends on training and education for adults as a percentage of their GDP, and the U.S. is pretty much at the bottom of the list. And even beyond that, private sector investment. So, we're at a time when employers are saying they can't find enough workers, that they can't find skilled people, but their investments in training they're training fewer workers than ever, and private sector investments have declined too. So I think if we want to be serious about preparing for the future and making sure people have the skills they need and making sure that our companies have the workers they need, we need to have a serious conversation about, how we can do more to support particularly kind of adult and mid-career workers.
Okay. Well, so for people listening, where can they find out more about what the Governors Association is doing, and how can they find out what they need to know to lessen their anxiety or have an action plan for themselves, their families, their community?
Of course. So check out our website, www.nga.org. But I'll also give a very specific call out to the Chair's initiative I mentioned, Good Jobs for All Americans. We'll be putting out a kind of summary of our findings in July this year when we were in Salt Lake City with all the governors. And we're going to have a pretty comprehensive list of kind of recommendations for state policymakers to respond to the changing nature of work and to better prepare workers. And you can also, the Chair's initiative itself has its own website. It's just www.nga.org/goodjobs. So we already have some decent information there. Feel free to check it out. It's easier to get engaged than you think. Look at the state of the state that your governor gave, check out their executive orders or their press releases, see what they're saying, and, never be shy about getting out there, asking questions, calling your local state legislator and seeing what they're doing, because they may have the exact same questions as you and not know how to answer them, but they're the people who can help start making progress on them.
That's great. Well, Mike, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
No, it's been my pleasure. This is a lot of fun.
You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you.